I knew the HOA was bad news, but I never expected them to bulldoze straight through my livelihood. It all started when Linda Kensington, the self-appointed queen of the Maple Ridge HOA, decided that my farm was an eyesore for the pristine suburban neighborhood next door. Never mind that my land had been here long before the HOA even existed. Never mind that I had legal rights to it. None of that mattered to Linda. I woke up one morning to the sound of heavy machinery. When I stepped out onto my porch, I nearly had a heart attack. A construction crew was tearing through my cornfield, flattening rows of crops as if they were nothing. I sprinted across my yard, waving my arms. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" A man in an orange vest barely spared me a glance. "We're putting in a new access road, HOA's orders." "HOA," I nearly choked on my anger. "This isn't HOA property, this is my land." "Not anymore," a smug voice chimed in. I turned to see Linda Kensington standing there, arms crossed, lips pursed in that condescending way that made me want to throw a bucket of manure at her. "You've been obstructing neighborhood traffic for too long, Jeremiah Parker," she said, as if scolding a child. "We needed a more direct route to the clubhouse, and your field was in the way." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer insanity of what she was saying. "You can't just build a road through my property." "Oh, but we can," she said, pulling out a stack of papers. "The HOA voted, and we decided this land was better suited for community access. You didn't respond to our letters." I grabbed the papers and skimmed through them. It was a pile of legal jargon, misinterpreted zoning laws, and a lot of nonsense about eminent domain, which the HOA absolutely did not have the authority to enforce. "You think a neighborhood vote gives you the right to steal my land?" I snapped. "It's not stealing," Linda said with an infuriatingly sweet smile. "It's improving the community." I clenched my fists, watching as the bulldozers continued to rip through my crops. Years of work gone in a day. Fine. They wanted a road. They were going to regret it. I wasn't going to let Linda Kensington and her HOA cronies trample over my rights. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But first, I needed to stop the destruction before they tore up any more of my land. I stormed back to my house, grabbed my phone, and made a call to the county zoning office. The woman on the other end, Miss Delgado, listened as I explained the situation. When I got to the part where the HOA had unilaterally decided to plow a road through my crops, there was a long pause. "That's highly illegal," she finally said. "HOAs don't have the authority to seize private property, let alone use eminent domain. Did they file any permits? If they did, I sure wasn't informed. I'll check our records." "Give me a few minutes." While I waited, I watched the bulldozers continue their destruction. The crew didn't seem to care that they were trespassing. They were just following orders, but that didn't mean I had to sit back and let it happen. Miss Delgado called back. They didn't file anything. "No permits, no request for rezoning, nothing. This is a major violation. I'm sending an inspector immediately." That was step one. But I wasn't going to stop there. I walked back outside, approached the construction foreman, and handed him a printed copy of my property deed. "This is private land. You're trespassing." The man hesitated. "HOA said." "I don't care what the HOA said. They don't own this property. You're going to stop right now unless you want to be personally liable when the county gets involved." That put some doubt in his eyes. He waved down his crew and the machines rumbled to a stop. Linda, who had been standing nearby with that same smug expression, rushed over. "You have no authority to stop this," she snapped. I held up my phone. "Zoning office says otherwise. They're sending an inspector." "You did file the proper permits, right?" For the first time, her confidence wavered. She narrowed her eyes. "This is just a misunderstanding." Funny how these misunderstandings always seem to work in your favor. Before she could respond, a county truck pulled up. A man in a button-down shirt and reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Calloway from the zoning department. "I understand there's an issue with property boundaries," he asked. I gestured to the half-finished road cutting through my field. "The HOA decided they could carve this through my farm without my consent." Mr. Calloway's expression darkened as he surveyed the damage. He turned to Linda. "Do you have the necessary permits for this construction?" She folded her arms. "The HOA board approved it." "We don't need additional permits." Mr. Calloway let out a sharp breath. That's not how the law works. This is private property. You're in clear violation of multiple zoning regulations. Linda's face tightened. This land is under the HOA's jurisdiction. Mr. Calloway shook his head. Absolutely not. HOAs regulate neighborhoods, not independent farmland. You have no authority here. She opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand. I'm issuing an immediate stop work order. Any further construction will result in legal action. The construction crew wasted no time packing up. They didn't want to be involved in an illegal land grab. Linda, however, wasn't done. This isn't over, she hissed at me before stomping away. I watched her go, knowing full well she'd try something else, and I was ready for it. If she wanted a road, I'd give her one on my terms. The next morning, I started setting up my counterattack. I consulted a lawyer, who confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had zero legal claim to my land, but since they had already built a partial road, I had the right to regulate its use. That gave me an idea. With the help of a few friends, I installed sturdy metal toll booths at both ends of the new road. Big, professional-looking signs announced the new rates, $50 per vehicle per entry, no exceptions. By mid-afternoon, the first HOA members tried to use the road. They barely made it 10 feet before stopping at the toll booth. One of Linda's lackeys, a man named Greg, leaned out of his car window. "What the hell is this?" I leaned against the booth, tipping my hat. "Private toll road." Since the HOA wanted it so badly, I figured I'd make it official. "You can't charge us to use this road," he sputtered. "Sure I can, it's my land." Greg turned red. "Linda's going to hear about this." "I'm counting on it," word spread fast. Within hours, a line of frustrated HOA members had formed at both ends of the road, all furious at the unexpected fee. Some turned around, others argued, only to be met with the same response: pay up or turn back. Then Linda herself arrived. She stepped out of her car, nostrils flaring. "This is ridiculous," I crossed my arms. "You built a road on my land without permission. Now I'm charging for its use." "You're being petty," I shrugged. "Call it what you want, but unless you're willing to cough up $50, you're not getting through." She clenched her jaw. "I'll take this to the board," I laughed. "Go ahead. HOA rules don't apply to me, remember?" She fumed, but there was nothing she could do. The road was on my property, and I had every right to regulate its use. By the end of the day, the HOA members were in an uproar. Their shortcut had turned into an expensive nuisance, and Linda had no way to undo it. This was just the beginning. If she wanted a war, she was about to find out just how stubborn I could be. Linda Kensington underestimated me. She thought she could steamroll over my property rights and get away with it. But now, her precious shortcut had turned into a financial nightmare for the HOA, and the members were furious. The toll booths weren't just a symbolic victory, they were bleeding the HOA dry. I had cameras set up at both ends of the road, capturing every disgruntled resident who turned around in frustration. Some tried to argue, but none of them had a legal leg to stand on. A few even begrudgingly paid the toll, but the outrage was growing. And I knew exactly what would happen next. Linda would try to retaliate. By the third day, she arrived with 2 uniformed police officers. That didn't surprise me. Linda loved to throw her weight around, and she must have thought flashing a badge at me would scare me into backing down. The officers stepped forward, and the taller one, Officer Ramirez, took the lead. Linda hovered behind them, arms crossed, smug as ever. Ramirez was polite but firm. He asked if I had the proper permits to operate a toll road. I handed over the legal paperwork my lawyer had helped me obtain. After reading through it, Ramirez's expression remained neutral, but I could see the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "This checks out," he said, handing the papers back. "It's all legal." Linda's face turned red. "There has to be something you can do." "He's extorting people." Ramirez shook his head. "It's his property. If you built this road without permission, that's your problem." Linda sputtered, but the officers weren't interested in her tantrum. They left, and she was forced to retreat, humiliated in front of several HOA members who had gathered to watch. That evening, I got a call from my lawyer, Mr. Whitaker. He had been digging into the HOA's finances, and what he found was pure gold. "They don't have the money to fight this," he said. They've been using resident fines and dues to fund personal projects. If you push them, they'll crumble. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I mailed a formal complaint to the county, detailing the illegal road construction and the HOA's misuse of funds. I attached every piece of evidence I had: photos, videos, paperwork. Then I took it a step further. I printed flyers detailing the HOA's financial mismanagement and handed them out to every resident. People were already mad about the toll booth, but when they learned their fees had been funneled into Linda's pet projects instead of community maintenance, the neighborhood turned on her. By the weekend, a group of homeowners called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. My cameras captured Linda storming out of the clubhouse, her usual arrogance replaced with something I hadn't seen before: fear. The next day, she showed up at my property, alone. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want?" I leaned against the toll booth, arms crossed. "What do you mean?" She gestured at the road. "You've made your point. Name your price to take this all down." I tilted my head. "You think this is about money?" She scoffed. "Of course it is. Everything is." I shook my head. "You still don't get it. This is about you thinking you can cheat people and never face consequences." She rolled her eyes. "Spare me the lecture." I pulled out a thick folder and handed it to her. "This is a summary of everything I sent to the county. You're looking at multiple violations, fines, and possibly legal action. Your best bet is to step down before you're forced out." She flipped through the pages, her fingers tightening around the folder. "You're bluffing." "I guess we'll find out," I said. For the first time since this started, she had nothing to say. She turned on her heel and walked away. A week later, she resigned. The HOA scrambled to recover, but the damage was done. Residents voted in new leadership, and one of their first actions was to negotiate with me to remove the toll booths in exchange for full compensation for my destroyed crops and a legally binding agreement that they would never attempt to claim my land again. I agreed. When the bulldozers came back, it wasn't to tear through my fields, it was to restore them. Linda vanished from the neighborhood, and my farm remained mine, untouched. Turns out, when you stand your ground, bullies like her don't know what to do. With Linda gone, the HOA had no choice but to clean up the mess she left behind. A new board was elected, and while they were more reasonable, they were also desperate to regain the trust of the residents. The toll booth fiasco had turned the entire neighborhood against the HOA, and they were scrambling to undo the damage. A few days after Linda's resignation, a man named David Holloway, the newly appointed HOA president, showed up at my farm. He was younger than Linda, maybe in his mid-40s, with a nervous energy that told me he wasn't used to dealing with situations like this. He hesitated before stepping onto my porch, adjusting his tie like it might give him the confidence he lacked. He introduced himself, then got straight to the point. The HOA wanted to formally negotiate a resolution regarding the road. They were willing to compensate me for the destroyed crops, but they also wanted to find a way to incorporate the road into the community without the toll booths. I listened without interrupting. Unlike Linda, David wasn't trying to bulldoze over my rights. He was cautious, careful with his words, and genuinely seemed like he wanted to fix things. That didn't mean I trusted him, but I was willing to hear him out. After he finished, I leaned against the porch railing and studied him. There was a slight shift in his stance, like he wasn't sure if I was going to throw him off my property. I asked him why the HOA was so desperate to keep the road. David admitted that the shortcut had become popular among the residents, but more importantly, the HOA had already allocated funds for additional infrastructure based on the assumption that the road would remain in use. If I refused to negotiate, they would have to scrap several planned projects, and that would make the new board look bad right out of the gate. That was what this was really about. The HOA needed a win. I told him I wasn't opposed to letting the road stay, but there would be conditions. First, they would have to pay for the full restoration of my damaged farmland, not just the crops. Second, I wanted a legally binding document that guaranteed the HOA would never attempt to claim my land again. And third, they had to cover the legal fees I had incurred dealing with Linda's nonsense. David didn't argue. He nodded, said he would bring my terms to the board, and left looking relieved that I hadn't outright refused. The next few days were quiet, but I wasn't naive enough to believe things were settled just yet. I kept my cameras running, kept my documents in order, and waited. By the end of the week, David returned with an official agreement. The HOA had accepted my terms. They would pay for the land restoration, cover my legal fees, and sign a document that permanently restricted them from attempting to claim any portion of my property. In exchange, I would remove the toll booths and allow the road to remain open for community use. I read through every page carefully, making sure there were no loopholes. Then I had my lawyer review it as well. Everything checked out. Once the paperwork was signed, the restoration work began. The HOA hired contractors to repair the damage done to my fields, and I made sure they did it properly. They replaced the torn-up soil, replanted what had been destroyed, and even installed a new irrigation system to make up for the losses. For the first time since this mess started, things were finally going in the right direction. But just when I thought it was over, a new problem emerged. Linda might have been gone, but not everyone in the HOA was happy about the deal. A small but vocal group of homeowners started complaining that the new board had caved to me. They argued that the toll booths had been an insult to the community, and that the HOA should have fought harder to keep control of the road. At first, it was just grumbling at meetings, but then they started pushing back in more tangible ways. They pressured the board to introduce new restrictions aimed at me, proposing bans on farm equipment noise, limits on unsightly structures, and even an attempt to impose rules on the aesthetic of my property. It was a sneaky way of coming after me without directly violating the agreement. I saw it for what it was: spite. When David came by again, he looked exhausted. He admitted that some of the more stubborn HOA members were causing problems, but he assured me that the board had no intention of enforcing any restrictions on my property. I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for a way to shut them down for good. I started attending HOA meetings, something I had never done before. Technically, I wasn't under their jurisdiction, but since the road was now part of the community, I had every right to be there. The first meeting I showed up to was tense. A few of Linda's old allies glared at me, but I ignored them. I listened as they tried to push new restrictions, then stood up and calmly pointed out that their proposals were unenforceable. They hated that. Over the next few weeks, I kept showing up, shutting down every attempt to target my farm with arbitrary rules. And I wasn't alone. The residents who had turned against Linda started speaking up as well, calling out the pettiness for what it was. The more they pushed, the more they lost. Eventually, the troublemakers realized they weren't going to win. One by one, they stopped showing up to meetings. By the time the next election rolled around, most of them had been voted off the board. I kept my distance after that. The HOA had finally learned its place, and I wasn't interested in getting involved beyond making sure they stayed in check. Months passed, and the road remained, but now it was just a road, not a battleground. My farm was fully restored, and the HOA had been forced to accept that I wasn't someone they could push around. Linda never returned to the neighborhood. As for me, I went back to my work, knowing that if the HOA ever tried anything again, I'd be more than ready to remind them who really owned this land. The battle with the HOA had settled into an uneasy truce, but I never let my guard down. There was always someone in these kinds of organizations who just couldn't accept defeat. Even though Linda had been exiled from the neighborhood's good graces and the new board had agreed to my terms, I had a feeling there were still a few sore losers waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I was out near the restored section of my field, checking the irrigation system that the HOA had paid to replace. The crops had bounced back, and the land was finally returning to the way it had been before the bulldozers had torn through it. Just as I was finishing up, I noticed a car creeping along the side of the road. It wasn't one of the usual HOA members, and something about the way it slowed near my property put me on edge. I pretended not to notice and continued working, but I kept the car in my peripheral vision. It pulled to a stop just outside my fence, and a man in a suit stepped out. He wasn't anyone I recognized from the neighborhood. He lingered by the edge of the road, looking around like he was surveying the property. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over, making sure to stand in front of the "No Trespassing" sign that was clearly posted. The man turned as I approached, giving me a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Richard Langley, a representative from a real estate development firm. That set off alarm bells immediately. I didn't say anything, just waited for him to explain why he was here. He adjusted his tie and got straight to the point. The HOA had expressed interest in selling off certain portions of land for future development, and my farm was one of the areas they were considering. I let out a slow breath, keeping my expression neutral. Richard continued, saying that his firm was prepared to make a generous offer to purchase the land, should I be willing to sell. He even had a sleek folder tucked under his arm, probably filled with paperwork designed to pressure me into making a quick decision. I asked him who in the HOA had given him the impression that my land was for sale. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying it had been brought up in recent discussions. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone in the HOA, most likely one of Linda's old allies, was trying to go around me. They couldn't force me to give up my property, so their next best option was to try and buy me out. I asked Richard if he was aware that my farm wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. He gave a slow nod, saying that while he understood the technicalities, his firm specialized in finding solutions that work for all parties involved. I told him I wasn't interested. Richard didn't seem surprised. He simply said that the offer would remain open, and that I should consider the benefits of selling before future development changed the area. I watched as he got back into his car and drove off, already knowing this wouldn't be the last time I heard from him. Instead of waiting for the next move, I decided to get ahead of it. That evening, I went through my legal paperwork again, making sure every document that protected my property was in order. Then, I paid a visit to David Holloway. When I arrived at his house, he looked genuinely confused to see me. He invited me inside, and I got straight to the point. I told him about Richard Langley's visit and asked if the HOA had been discussing my land behind closed doors. David immediately denied it, saying that no such discussion had taken place in any official meetings. He seemed frustrated, shaking his head as he muttered about certain board members going rogue. That confirmed my suspicion. Someone was still trying to find a way to push me out. David promised he would look into it and assured me that the HOA had no authority to sell or negotiate anything involving my property. While I appreciated his response, I wasn't about to sit back and trust that he could handle it. I started digging into Richard Langley's company. A few calls to some contacts in the zoning office revealed that his firm had a history of working with HOAs to pressure homeowners into selling land by manipulating zoning regulations. They would push for changes that made it difficult for homeowners to maintain their properties, then swoop in with an offer when the owners were at their breaking point. That wasn't going to happen to me. A few days later, I spotted Richard's car again. This time, he wasn't alone. He was standing near the road with another man who looked like a surveyor, pointing at different sections of my land. I walked up to them without hesitation. Richard greeted me with that same empty smile, acting as if this was just a friendly visit. I told him he was trespassing. He feigned surprise, saying he was just assessing the area for potential improvements. I asked him what kind of improvements he thought he had the right to make on private property. He gave a carefully measured response, saying that as the community expanded, there would be opportunities for collaborative growth. That was enough for me. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's department. Richard's smile stiffened as I calmly explained to the dispatcher that there were unauthorized individuals conducting surveys on my land. He tried to backpedal, saying there was no need for law enforcement, but I didn't let up. By the time a deputy arrived, Richard and his surveyor were already looking uncomfortable. The deputy listened to my explanation, then turned to Richard and asked if he had permission to be on my land. Richard tried to argue that he was just gathering information for potential development, but the deputy wasn't interested in his excuses. He told them both to leave and issued a warning that any further trespassing would result in legal action. Richard left without another word, and I knew I had sent a message loud and clear. Just to be sure, I installed additional cameras along the road in my property lines. If anyone else tried to pull something, I'd have evidence. Over the next few weeks, I kept a close eye on the HOA meetings. The push to develop the land had lost momentum, and the new board members were more interested in fixing the damage Linda had caused than stirring up another battle. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I made sure to renew my legal protections, updating everything to ensure there were no loopholes for the HOA or any developer to exploit. Richard Langley never came back. As for the HOA, they finally learned that my land wasn't up for negotiation. And if anyone ever forgot that fact, I was more than ready to remind them. Not long after Richard Langley vanished from my property for good, the last of the HOA's resistance crumbled. The board members who had secretly tried to push me out found themselves under scrutiny when word got out that they had been negotiating with developers behind closed doors. It wasn't just me who had a problem with it. Residents who had fought to remove Linda weren't about to let another batch of schemers take over. A recall vote was organized, and within a month, every remaining Linda loyalist was gone. David Holloway, to his credit, stayed on as president, and I could tell he was relieved to be rid of the troublemakers. With the HOA finally under stable leadership, I was able to shift my focus back to my farm without constantly looking over my shoulder. The road remained open, the toll booths long dismantled, and the agreement between me and the HOA ensured that no one would ever try to claim my land again. But just when I thought everything had settled for good, I received an unexpected visitor. One afternoon, as I was loading hay onto my truck, I noticed a woman standing near the edge of my property. She wasn't dressed like a typical HOA member. No designer clothes, no clipboard, no air of superiority. Instead, she wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a look of hesitation. She introduced herself as Melanie Carter, Linda Kensington's niece. That caught me off guard. I hadn't heard anything about Linda since she slunk away from the neighborhood in disgrace. I asked Melanie what she wanted, and she let out a sigh before explaining that she had come to apologize for Linda. Apparently, after Linda lost her grip on the HOA, she had left town entirely. She had burned so many bridges that even her former allies wanted nothing to do with her. According to Melanie, Linda had lost her home after being forced to pay back misappropriated HOA funds, and she had been struggling ever since. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't the type to take pleasure in someone else's downfall, but I also wasn't about to forget what Linda had tried to pull. Melanie went on to say that Linda had been too proud to admit she had been wrong, but that didn't mean she didn't regret what had happened. I asked Melanie why she was telling me this. She hesitated before saying that Linda had always been stubborn, but deep down, she had convinced herself that everything she did had been for the good of the community. It wasn't until she lost everything that she realized how badly she had miscalculated. I let that sink in. Then I told Melanie something I had never said out loud before. I never wanted things to escalate the way they had. I just wanted to be left alone to run my farm. Linda had been the one who refused to listen, who thought she had the right to take what wasn't hers. Actions had consequences, and she had learned that lesson the hard way. Melanie nodded, seeming to understand. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't try to justify what Linda had done. She just wanted to make sure I knew that, in the end, Linda had realized her mistakes. After Melanie left, I went back to work, but her words stuck with me. Linda had spent years controlling people, manipulating them into thinking she knew what was best for them. The moment she lost that control, she had nothing left. I didn't pity her, but I did understand. With the HOA finally under reasonable leadership and the last remnants of Linda's influence erased, Maple Ridge became a place where people could actually enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary fines and power-hungry board members. As for me, I kept my land, my farm, and my peace. And I made sure that no one ever forgot who really owned this land.